So
And
that brings me to another question. As I said before, a lot of times when we talk about domestic violence, we generally understand it to be women being victims. But you made a fantastic point, and I think that is a beautiful highlight for a discussion on this program because you don't really hear many people talking about this as what you have just said when it comes to men in recent time being victims. So, do you think that can be because of education, because of money, because of career and profession? And what I mean by that is we do see a lot of times nowadays that many a woman got more education than their spouse, than the husband. They got more money than the husband. They got a better job than the husband. They got a better prestige in society than the husband. And I mean, credit goes to the women nowadays who have that kind of achievement and ability. But do you think that can be one of the contributors towards domestic violence where men become victims of that kind of situation?
I think it can be attributed. I think it can be, one of the things that add to it. I don't think it's the cause. Um, Domestic violence again is about complete control. A lot of times, there are role reversals where we have dads that stay home and raise kids and moms that work. And that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't necessarily mean that, a stay-at-home dad is, submissive or a victim of domestic violence.
That's a good
I think
point.
the
Yeah.
biggest change is that gender roles have changed. I've written a book called Wife Beater Shirt Optional. There is no dress code for domestic violence. And it looks at the myths and misperceptions of domestic violence. And I've written it in a gender neutral fashion because it really, we can't say women are the only victims, especially with the younger generation, um, that gender roles are so fluid and gender identity is changing every day. Years ago, when I started working with victims of domestic violence, there were very traditional gender roles. There were different societal norms as far as what was acceptable and what wasn't. The history of domestic violence first, they always thought of domestic violence as a family issue. And first they said, well, you can't really be mean to animals. It's not nice to be mean to animals. And then they said, well, maybe you can't be abusive to kids either. And it's only been since the 80s, the 1980s, that they've really started, and it started with men to women, but now again, we're looking at both sexes where they're saying, maybe it's more than a family issue, and that, a wife doesn't necessarily have to be considered property. Old English common law allowed men to beat their wives as long as the stick they used was no bigger than their thumb.
I like that. That is
And
interesting.
a lot of times, again, people focus on physical violence, but there's also emotional violence, which is on your heart, on your feelings, on your self-esteem. There's mental abuse, which the common term now, you see it all over social media, is gaslighting, which is basically crazy making, or when one partner tries to make the other partner think that they're going crazy, based on a movie from the 1940s called Gaslight, driving too fast to frighten or intimidate somebody, manipulating them, coercing them. Sexual violence. People don't know that sexual violence can exist both in intimate partner relationships and in marriages. Um, the destruction of property or pets. A lot of times, victims care more about their pets than they do about themselves. But it's also the message. Well, this time it's Rover or Fifi. The next time it could be you. And so it plays into the mental abuse, the financial abuse, the isolation. There's a myth that it can't happen to people of means, but really what they do is cut off all their credit cards or track all their spending with the credit cards. And just because people in a marriage may have financial security, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily easier for them to get out. 70%, by research, in my experience, it's much higher than that, but 70% of victims that get killed in violent relationships get killed when they leave. Because it's about the power and control. And when the victim takes the control back, that's when the abusive partner says, if I can't have you, nobody will, or I love you to death. And that's when it's the most dangerous. So safety planning needs to happen before a victim stays. And so often we hear, why does he or she stay? Why don't they leave? Sometimes in the short run, it's easier to stay than to leave. And interestingly enough, again, we talk about victim blaming and victim shaming. Everybody talks about why the victim stays, but how often do you hear, why does he or she batter their partner? People don't ask that question. They only ask why the person stays. They don't ask why the egregious behavior is happening.